I wanted to share a story with you, something that happened to me a couple of years ago when I was still working night shifts as a cop. I don't usually talk about it, but I figured your audience would appreciate hearing this. It was late one night, probably around 2 a.m., and I was on my way back to the station to finish up my shift. I'd been out patrolling some back roads in a quieter part of town, just to pass the time. It was a routine night, nothing out of the ordinary, at least not yet. As I'm driving, I see an abandoned car on the side of the road with its hazard lights flashing. Now, we see this sort of thing all the time. People break down, run out of gas, or leave their car for whatever reason. But something about this car seemed off. It was sitting in the middle of nowhere, no houses around, no other cars in sight. I pulled over, figuring I'd take a look, maybe get the license plate, and have it towed if no one showed up. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the car, and approached the vehicle. As I got closer, I noticed the driver's side window was smashed in. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I shined my light inside and saw it. Blood. There was blood smeared across the dashboard and some on the seat. My first thought was maybe it was an accident, maybe someone got hurt and took off to get help. But as I scanned the inside of the car more, I noticed a trail of blood leading away from the car, toward the woods that bordered the road. At this point, my training kicked in, someone was hurt, and I had to find them. I figured they couldn't have gone far, given the amount of blood I was seeing. So, I followed the trail. It led me into the woods, which were pitch black except for the beam of my flashlight. The further I went, the thicker the trees got, and the quieter it became. There wasn't even the sound of animals rustling, just silence. I remember thinking how wrong it felt, like I shouldn't have been out there alone, but I kept moving forward. The blood trail was getting lighter, but it was still there. I must have walked for about 5 or 10 minutes when I saw something ahead, near the base of a tree. At first, I thought it was a pile of clothes or maybe trash someone had dumped. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. He was slumped against the tree, barely conscious, covered in blood. His clothes were soaked, and there was a deep gash along his side. It looked like he had been bleeding out for a while. I knelt down next to him, trying to get a response, but he was too weak to speak. His eyes barely opened when I spoke to him. I radioed for backup immediately, and while I waited, I did my best to stop the bleeding. He wasn't in good shape, and I honestly didn't think he was going to make it. I kept pressure on the wound, talking to him, trying to keep him awake. I remember how cold it was out there, and the whole time I kept glancing around, half expecting someone to come out of the trees. It felt like forever before I heard the sirens in the distance. When the paramedics got there, they worked on him for a while before rushing him to the hospital. I found out later that he survived, but just barely. If I hadn't followed that blood trail when I did, he wouldn't have made it. To this day, I have no idea what really happened. I never got the full story about who attacked him or why he was left out there like that. The whole thing still feels surreal when I think about it. I've seen some rough stuff on the job, but this was different. The way it all went down, the feeling of being out there alone in those woods, it's something that sticks with you. I've been a police officer for a little over 6 years now, and I've seen my fair share of disturbing things on the job. But nothing could have prepared me for this one night. It's the kind of call that still keeps me up sometimes, replaying over and over in my head. It started as a routine call around 11 o'clock p.m. Dispatch sent me to check on an Airbnb after the guests reported a strange smell. They weren't sure if it was a gas leak, something dead, or just a bad odor, but they wanted it looked into. Now, I've been to enough of these calls to know it's usually nothing. Maybe someone left food out or didn't clean up after the last party. I wasn't expecting anything serious. When I arrived, the couple renting the place seemed normal enough. They were polite, but you could tell they were bothered by the smell. It was a nice house, clean, modern, the kind of place people rent to get away for the weekend. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped inside. It was strong, almost overwhelming. If you've ever smelled something decaying, you know it's a smell you can't mistake for anything else. I kept calm and tried not to show any alarm. The couple didn't need to know what I was thinking. I told them it was probably a leak or maybe something trapped in the walls, just to keep them at ease. They let me take a look around the house while they stayed downstairs. As I walked through, everything seemed normal. The kitchen was spotless, the living room was neatly set up, and the bedrooms upstairs looked untouched. But the smell, it kept getting worse. By the time I reached the upstairs hallway, I knew something was off. I noticed the smell was strongest near the ceiling, right below what I figured had to be an attic. I found the attic door and pulled down the stairs. Every instinct in me was telling me to call for backup, but I didn't want to jump the gun. I climbed up, and the second my head cleared the top of the stairs, I froze. There, in the far corner of the attic, was a body hanging from the rafters. The skin was gray and bloated, clearly decomposing. It looked like it had been there for a while, maybe days, maybe longer. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't freak out. I had to keep it together. I backed down the stairs slowly, trying not to make any noise. I shut the attic door and took a deep breath. There was no way I was telling the couple what I had just found. Not yet. I walked back downstairs, doing my best to act like everything was fine. I told them it was probably just a leak in the attic causing the smell. They seemed relieved, no suspicion at all. I suggested they wait outside while I called someone to come take a look. Thankfully, they didn't ask too many questions and stepped outside without a fuss. As soon as they were out of earshot, I radioed the station. My voice was steady, but inside I was shaking. I requested backup, but I didn't give too many details over the radio. I didn't want to start a panic. Within minutes, 4 or 5 squad cars pulled up to the house. The flashing lights were probably the first sign to the couple that something was off. My colleagues pulled me aside, and I told them what I found. The look on their faces said it all. That's when the couple came back over, clearly confused now that more police were showing up. I had no choice but to tell them the truth. I explained that there was a body in the attic, and that I didn't tell them right away because I didn't want to freak them out. The color drained from their faces, and you could see the panic setting in. They were quickly escorted away from the property while the crime scene team arrived. We eventually took the body down, but here's the thing. No one knew who the person was, how long they'd been up there, or how they even got there. The house had been rented out to multiple people over the past few weeks, and no one had noticed anything until that night. The Airbnb owners claimed they had no idea about the body either, but that didn't sit right with me. How does a body hang in the attic of your property without anyone knowing? Even though the case was eventually closed, the whole thing left me with a feeling I couldn't shake. Who was this person? How did they end up there? And how many people had stayed in that house, completely unaware of what was hanging above their heads? I've handled some disturbing calls in my time, but this one still haunts me. I was driving home from a friend's house late one night, sticking to the usual route I always took. It was a quiet night, with barely any traffic on the road. The kind of night where everything seemed still, almost like the world was taking a breath. My car's tires hummed against the pavement, and the only sound keeping me company was the soft rhythm of my playlist, which I had playing quietly in the background. I wasn't rushing, there was no need. I had been up for hours, and though I wasn't sleepy, the fatigue of the day was starting to settle in. I remember how calm the drive felt, with the soft glow of streetlights occasionally flickering as I passed. The road was empty, no headlights in my rearview mirror, no one ahead of me. The quiet felt almost comforting, and for a while I found myself on autopilot, my mind wandering as the car moved steadily down the highway. As I neared a long, familiar stretch of highway, I saw it, a faint flicker of blue and red lights in my rearview mirror. It was distant at first, barely noticeable, but within seconds the lights became brighter, flashing insistently. I glanced at the speedometer, confused. I wasn't speeding, not even close. I had always been a careful driver, keeping within the speed limits and avoiding anything that would attract a cop's attention. My mind raced, trying to figure out why I was being pulled over. Maybe a taillight was out, I thought, or maybe I'd accidentally run through a stop sign back in the neighborhood without noticing. Still, none of that seemed right. I hadn't seen any other cars for miles, and I hadn't done anything wrong. But the lights kept flashing, and the car behind me was now tailing close, signaling for me to pull over. I sighed, figuring it was something minor. There was no reason to panic. I signaled and slowly pulled off to the shoulder, the crunch of gravel under my tires breaking the night's silence. The car behind me came to a stop as well, parking just a few feet back, its blue and red lights still flashing. I sat there for a moment, waiting. My fingers hovered over the steering wheel, and I glanced around, looking for any sign of who was about to approach my car. That's when I noticed something odd. The flashing lights were there, but there was no spotlight, no familiar beams of a police flashlight cutting through the night as the officer approached. I stared in the rearview mirror, expecting the usual, an officer in a crisp uniform, a badge glinting in the light. But instead, a figure stepped out, and it immediately sent a chill down my spine. The person wasn't wearing a uniform at all. No badge, no hat, just jeans and a plain jacket. I blinked, thinking maybe I was seeing it wrong in the dark. But no. The closer they got, the more obvious it became. This wasn't a cop. Something about the way they moved, the casualness of their approach, felt off. It lacked the professionalism you expect when you get pulled over. They walked toward my car too casually, like they didn't care if I noticed the discrepancy. There was no sense of urgency or authority, just slow, deliberate steps. My fingers hovered over the window controls, but something inside me screamed not to roll it down. I stared at the figure for a second too long, my heart beginning to race. Every part of me knew this wasn't right. My mind flashed with possibilities. Who was this person? Why were they pretending to be a cop? And more importantly, what would happen if I stayed? Instinct took over before I could fully process what was happening. My hand shifted the car back into drive, and my foot pressed down on the gas. The engine revved as I sped off, leaving the figure standing in the rearview mirror. I could see them pause for a split second before turning back to their car. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back again. My mind was on overdrive, my body running on pure adrenaline. As I accelerated down the highway, I noticed the flashing lights had returned, and the car was trying to follow me. They were gaining on me fast, but I didn't plan on stopping again. The road was deserted, long stretches of highway with nothing but darkness on either side. I pushed the pedal harder, feeling the engine strain as I tried to put more distance between us. But the car behind me wasn't slowing down. The lights were still flashing, and the driver seemed determined to catch up. A knot formed in my stomach as I realized I didn't know how this would end. I didn't know what the person wanted or what they were capable of. All I knew was that stopping again wasn't an option. I had to keep going. I had to get away. After what felt like an eternity of driving, I noticed the lights behind me flicker and then disappear. I glanced in the mirror, seeing the car finally turning off onto a side road, the pursuit ending as abruptly as it had started. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I forced myself to slow down, bringing the car back to a manageable speed. I didn't stop until I reached a more populated area, a gas station with bright fluorescent lights that seemed like a beacon of safety. I pulled in and parked, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. I sat there for a moment, letting the tension drain from my body, my mind still reeling from the events of the last few minutes. I didn't report it right away. It wasn't out of fear or anything like that. I just couldn't wrap my head around what had happened. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Who pretends to be a cop like that? What were they planning? What would have happened if I had stayed and rolled down the window? The next day, after I had calmed down and had some time to think, I called the local police department. I explained everything that had happened. from the moment I saw the lights to the moment I sped away. The officer on the other end listened quietly, then told me something that sent chills through me again. There had been multiple reports of a similar vehicle impersonating police officers in the area. People had been pulled over late at night, just like me, but not all of them had managed to drive away. Some had been robbed, threatened, or worse. I was lucky. I realized that now. I had gotten away in time, but it could have easily gone the other way. Since then, every time I drive home late at night, I can't help but think about that night.